Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar for NCOSS members. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. For me, that is the Gadigal people. I will pay my respect to their elders past and present. It's also worth acknowledging that we are in National Reconciliation Week, and the theme is to be a voice for generations, encouraging all Australians to be a voice for reconciliation in tangible ways in everyday lives. I hope that's something that people can reflect on and take action on as we move forward, particularly this year with the upcoming referendum on the voice. My name is Ben McAlpine. I'm Director of Policy and Advocacy here at NCOSS, and for another 3 weeks, I'm also the acting CEO because Joanna Quilty is overseas on a Churchill Fellowship, which is why she's unable to join us today. So thank you all for coming. We launched this incredibly exciting piece of research in April, and we're really keen to be getting this out to all of our members. The purpose of this workshop is here on the screen. We want to make sure that we share the findings of the research, including the themes regarding who is experiencing poverty and where they live. We want to talk about the recommendations that we highlighted in the report and talk a bit about how that might be influencing our advocacy. And then really importantly, we want to be able to demonstrate to you how to use the data visualization tools. So we really want you to come away from this session with a strong understanding of the key findings, but also want you to be able to know how to use the report and the data tools so that you can inform your own service delivery and any advocacy that you might be doing as well. The session outline, welcome and introduction, is happening now for 5 minutes. Already a little bit behind time, but that's okay. We'll have about 30 minutes where I'll be walking through the research, the findings and recommendations. Another 10 minutes where we'll walk through the online tools themselves. Then we really want to have a good amount of time for any questions from you. That time will be flexible, of course, but we want to just give you a sense of how this may all play out over the next hour and a half. So I'll start just giving a high level overview of the research. So this was the second Mapping Economic Disadvantage in New South Wales report that we released, and we did it in collaboration with NATSM at the University of Canberra. It takes the 2021 census data as well as the 2019 to 20 survey of income and housing, analyzes it, does some modelling, thanks to NATSM, and then creates maps of poverty rates for demographics across the state, be that for age, sex, employment, family arrangements, be that, for example, you've got a dependent couple with children or you're a lone person, and then housing tenure. Are you in the private rental market? Do you have a mortgage, etc.? And really importantly, this time we were able to compare the results to 2016, which allows us to see not only the current picture, but also how it changed. We called it the Great Divide. As we will explore through today's session, that title particularly captures the reality in Greater Sydney, but it also is absolutely relevant for the entire state. It's showing a significant worsening of poverty for some communities and also for others an improvement. And so that gap between those who are living in poverty and those who are not is widening, and we're really trying to draw attention to that issue. One question that might come up is, how did we define economic disadvantage? The main question here is the poverty rate, and so we took the broadly agreed definition of 50% of the median household disposable income. That was taken from the census. We removed housing costs, so we get a really clear picture of disposable income, and then we adjusted it slightly based on housing size and age. But I'll come to that as we go through it. So there are 2 reports and 2 data tools that we released. The first one on the left there, that's the detailed report from NATSM. So for those of you who really want to get into the depth of the report and the data, I would recommend that you go there, and this is all available on the webpage, which we'll provide. The second one there is the key themes report. That is the majority of what we'll be walking through today, 12 key themes through the report. And then on the right, 2 tools, again, we'll walk through them. The first one being the mapping tool, where you can drill into individual geographic regions. And then a new one that we launched this time being what we're calling the dashboard, where you can pick a particular SA2 area, so a geographic area, and see the key stats just for that area. And so we're really hoping that's a useful tool, particularly for service delivery organisations, but also local councils, politicians, government agencies and departments who are trying to see a picture at a local level. I'm going to start walking through the key themes, and please, if you have questions as they're popping up, please make sure you put them into the chat, and we will come to that when we get to questions closer to the end. So the first key theme, New South Wales now has 1 million people living in poverty. So at face value, the overall rate of poverty in New South Wales barely changed since 2016. So it's sitting at 13.4%. But while that sounds potentially like a good thing, that it hadn't at least got worse, population growth meant that we now have almost 1 million people living below the poverty line. And so what that meant is since 2016, there was an additional 100,000 people who now are living in poverty. So what that demonstrates to NCOSS is that what we're doing to address poverty is clearly not working. And it also highlights a critical area of concern. The census was collected in 2021, and we all know that with skyrocketing cost of living, interest rate hikes, rental increases, we would expect, and I'm sure you are all hearing, that the picture would be far worse today. If we look at just Sydney in isolation, this is really where that significant poverty divide is apparent, and it's clearly getting worse. So first, poverty is very concentrated in Sydney's western and southwestern suburbs. So you have a lot of depth of poverty in the west, and then comparatively low rates in the east. That does not mean in any way that there isn't poverty and people really doing it tough in those areas, but it's that gap that's really become apparent as a result of this research. The area with the lowest rate was Greenwich Riverview with 3.7%, whereas in Ashcroft Busby Miller, which is in Sydney's southwest, it was 32.9%. So that was a difference of almost 30 percentage points, which really shows you how that difference in concentration is being apparent in the city. And unfortunately, that poverty is also worsening. In Regent's Park, as an example, poverty increased by 53%, but that poverty rate in, for example, Mossman improved by 29%. So it's concentrated and getting worse in Sydney's southwest and west. And you can see that in the map. We've drawn a line, which colloquially people talk about as the latte line, or somewhere around there. And you can see those light and dark pink areas. That's where the depth of poverty is really apparent. And the yellow, greener colours to the east and to the northeast is where poverty is really low. So that, I think, is an incredibly demonstrative image of how poverty is appearing in Sydney and how it's getting worse in the west and better in the east. And we'll come to how you can use these tools for your own work later on. So I talked a little about Greater Sydney. Now it's important to reflect on rural and regional New South Wales. So the poverty rates are slightly higher, not too far off, but the impacts are incredibly different when you move outside Greater Sydney. So if you look at regional rural New South Wales, areas of higher concentration of poverty is scattered along the mid and far north coasts in patches of the northwest and then parts of New England and the central west. And the area that saw the greatest increase was in the Riverina. So there was a 45% increase in Hay and a 40% increase in Gundagai and Temora. And there are also worsening areas in New England and the far north coast. In terms of how it's different, we've got a few call-outs here. So for younger people, the rate outside of Greater Sydney is 25% higher. The drivers of that look like there was a substantial increase in younger people who are not in the labour force. So that went from 25% to 39%. That looks like it was driven by higher housing costs. And it could potentially be driven by higher unemployment rates for men in their 20s in regional and rural New South Wales. For children, this is a good news story at face value again, 22% lower in rural and regional New South Wales when compared to the city, and also dropped by 46%. The contributors of that was it appears that there was a decrease in the number of kids per family in poverty, particularly for single parent households, and there was a decrease in the number of couples with dependent children living in poverty. It appears, though, that that may have been due to some of that intrastate migration we were seeing throughout the real depths of the pandemic. So that may be hiding some of the true rates of poverty. But again, it's really important to understand how poverty is affecting different parts of the state. Unemployment, a significant difference, but again, there could be a bit of a trick in the data. So in Greater Sydney, there was a 33% decrease in poverty amongst unemployed people. But it appears that that was very much driven by people who are unemployed moving into other people's households. And it was particularly for younger people. So our theory here is that with increasing housing costs, younger people, they might be students, part-time work, just lower paid jobs at the beginning of their career. They've had to move back in with their parents, or they've moved in with friends due to unsustainable housing costs. So while the numbers look better, it's not necessarily a good story because it's actually being driven by a behaviour as a result of a broken housing system. So while we saw that in Greater Sydney, we didn't see that same change in rural and regional New South Wales. And for single parents, the rate reduced by 19%, which is a good thing, but it's still 39% higher in the capital city. That's most likely due to fewer well-paying jobs, fewer family-friendly jobs, and less availability of affordable childcare outside Greater Sydney, because something like 80% of single parents are women, and those are the types of issues that are affecting them more often than not. We move on to the next set of themes. So older people. Older people, so that was classified as over the age of 65, was the single age group that saw the largest increase. Of the 100,000 additional people living in poverty since 2016, 50,000 of those, so half, were over the age of 65. And it was particularly concentrated in Greater Sydney. Some of the areas that were really hard hit were Blue Haven, San Remo on the Central Coast. That was a 171% increase in poverty rate. Horsley Park in Western Sydney, that was 220% increase. And the poverty rate for this group in Liverpool East doubled. Again, high concentrations of poverty in Sydney's western and southwestern suburbs. Guildford, South Granville and Fairfield have more than 30% of people aged over 65 living in poverty. And there are also very high rates in Hunter Valley, Illawarra and Newcastle area. And one particularly concerning stat here was for older women in private rental, the rate of those living below the poverty line in Greater Sydney increased from 34%, that's 1 in 3, still pretty high, but increased from 34% to 53%. And in the rest of New South Wales, it grew a massive from 25% to 57%. So more than half of older women in private rentals are living below the poverty line. This is the map for the change in poverty rates for 65 and over. This is for all of New South Wales. You can see that while there are a few pockets across the state, generally the rate mostly stayed the same. Some areas improved, some got a little bit worse. You can see what appears to be a giant pink blob around Sydney. If we zoom in, that is the map for Greater Sydney. So those light and dark pink. Light pink is a 2 to 5 percentage point worsening, and the dark pink is more than 5%, a percentage point increase. So that demonstrates, particularly in Greater Sydney, the immense challenge that we have for this age group. And like I mentioned, particularly an example of older women who are living in the private rental market. So for children, good news was that the rate of children under 15 decreased by 2.5 percentage points, but they still face the highest rates of poverty in New South Wales of all age groups. And again, deep pockets of concentration. If we look at the SA2s, that's the ABS geographic area that is used in the maps. If you look at the areas that have a rate of poverty more than 20%, so where more than 1 in 5 kids live in poverty, there are 89 SA2s in Greater Sydney. None of them are in eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, and only 2 of them are in central Sydney. So the remaining 87 are all in the west and southwest regions of Sydney. An example, in Guildford South Granville, the rate is 41%. So 2 in 5 kids are living in poverty in that area. Outside of Greater Sydney, child poverty is particularly concentrated in mid-North Coast, parts of New England, Central Coast and around Batemans Bay. And while it may sound obvious, we know why it's so important to be grappling with childhood poverty. We know the significant long-term impact it has on their physical and mental health, their employment, their education, and their earnings throughout their lifetime. From an employment perspective, two of the 3 highest risk factors is being unemployed or being of a working age and not in the labour force. So if you were unemployed, it's 26.1%, so roughly 1 in 4. If you're aged 15 to 64 and not in the labour force, it's 32.5%, so almost 1 in 3. And that latter group, that's carers, students, and other people who've given up on looking for work, so particularly people with chronic health challenges or people with a disability. And obviously they face significant structural discrimination, which is one of the reasons they're not able to work. I noted earlier the decrease in unemployment in Greater Sydney. So again, at a face value, that's a good story, but it appears that may well be because they're moving into other people's households, not because the situation has improved. And for those not in the labour force, that group experienced one of the highest increases to poverty rates since 2016. And that's not because there are more people in that group. The proportion has not changed. It's simply a deepening of poverty for people who are in that situation, which again highlights the issues that we and many across the sector have with those income support payments, which we'll come to when we talk about recommendations. From an employment perspective, though, having a job is clearly not a guarantee against poverty, because 1 in 4 people who live in poverty also have a job. It's particularly a problem for part-time workers. So there was almost a 50% increase in poverty for that group. And who are they? They're far more likely to be young people, older people, and women. And there was a real concentration of poverty for people who are working part-time. So if you live in Liverpool East, 28% of part-time workers are living in poverty. In contrast, if you are living in Double Bay, Darling Point in the city's east, only 8% of part-time workers are living in poverty. When we look at this from a housing perspective, clearly shows that public housing as a starting point is no longer the safety net that it used to be. The single highest rate for people was people living in public housing, where almost 60% of tenants live below the poverty line. And that group saw the biggest percentage point increase since 2016. So to us, that clearly suggests that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system when one of the critical objectives of a public housing system would be to keep people out of poverty. If we look at private renters, and we're certainly seeing serious ongoing issues since 2021 in this space, but at the time, almost 1 in 5 renters in New South Wales were living in poverty. That's over 400,000 people. And in Greater Sydney, that was 275,000. The poverty rate for private renters in Greater Sydney increased by 10%. And not only did that poverty rate go up, the proportion of people living in private rentals also went up. So more people are becoming reliant on the private rental system, and we know the system is getting worse, and more of those people are falling into poverty. One of the more depressing maps, if we look at poverty rates for private renters across New South Wales, it's dark pink almost across the entire state. So that's over 20%. And then if we look at Greater Sydney, while that divide still exists, you can see that it starts to creep closer and closer towards the east. And certainly to that northern part of Sydney, they're still very much affected. But that is deep levels of poverty, particularly through southwest and the outer southwest parts of Sydney. In terms of some household composition, living by yourself or parenting on your own really puts people at significant risk of poverty. That's somewhat unsurprising because having only one source of income will put you at a far higher risk of poverty because you can't share the costs of living. The good news is that the poverty rate for single parents did decrease since 2016, and that was particularly in rural and regional areas. But there are still parts of New South Wales where that rate is above 50%, and it's more than 40% in some parts of Greater Sydney. And it's also a similar story for people living alone. We noted in the report that a lot of our policy discussion really does focus around families. You hear that a lot from politicians, but we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of this cohort because there are some incredibly high rates of poverty, including over 50% in some areas of regional New South Wales and Greater Sydney. And that cohort that I mentioned before, there was a big increase in that group for older women, particularly those living alone in private rentals. We also took a slightly different methodology, trying to get an understanding of how poverty is affecting specific communities. So to do that, we took a different measure of low income using the low income category from the census that doesn't take out its gross income and doesn't take out household costs. But it is still an entirely valid methodology to try to get a sense of, are there certain communities that are more likely to live in a low income household? So not necessarily below the poverty line, although they would possibly be captured in this, but certainly low income. And what that shows us is that economic disadvantage disproportionately impacts Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people from culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and people with a disability. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, They are twice as likely than non-Indigenous people to be living in a low-income household. For people belonging to culturally and linguistically diverse communities, substantially overrepresented at 2.2 times as likely, but in Greater Sydney it's 2.6 times. And for people with a disability, 3 times more likely than those without a disability to be living in a low-income household. And that cohort saw a 20% increase in the rate since 2016. So when we're talking to our elected officials and departments, we're really drilling into this area to show, yes, geographies, housing, composition, tenure, all that's important. But when we think about intersectionality, this is where it can get really important to drill into the information. And then finally, we looked at the COVID data because there was an overlap between lockdowns, temporary income support measures, and the census. And as many in the sector have noted, those temporary increase in income support worked, and they worked immediately. So it demonstrates the incredible power of raising the rate of income support payments and the profound and immediate impact it would have if we were able to do that. So those were the 12 key themes that we drew out as we were looking at the report. In terms of the 5 recommendations, we reflected on, obviously we couldn't come up with the all-encompassing plan to reduce poverty in New South Wales. What we tried to do was reflecting on our previous policy platforms, work by other members and friends and stakeholders in the sector to highlight what are some of the recommendations that we really want to draw attention to, particularly given some of the key themes. First one, and this was also linked because the timing was in the lead up to the federal budget, we have asked the New South Wales government to partner with us to advocate to lift the rate of income support payments. We didn't see that happen in the federal budget. Obviously, there was an improvement, but we all believe that there's much more work to be done. We particularly called for action on housing affordability. So we've asked to bolster supply of social housing in New South Wales to 10% of all housing stock by 2050. But what we're calling for there is a long-term plan with established targets, identified locations. If we need to, let's bring in innovative approaches to support rapid builds. We need that plan from the government. We've also asked that they commit to a housing first policy across New South Wales as they respond to the ongoing and worsening homelessness crisis in New South Wales. And we want to see them continue to extend and embed the Together Home program, which was essentially responsible for eradicating sleeping rough in that period of time. We're calling for greater protection on renters, and there's a lot happening at the moment, including this week, a select committee on some of the government's amendments that they're putting forward. And we're going to continue to push for increased rental supply. We want a cap on rental increases and improvements to the no grounds evictions. And we want to look at social housing rent, not rest, that's going to bug me for a long time, rent setting, going back to that 60%. If we have 60% of public housing tenants living in poverty, something's not right in how we're going through that process. We've asked them to better target cost of living relief products. So there's a plethora of those out there. If they're looking for budget neutral ways to try to reduce the problems, and we're trying to work with them to increase or to better target those packages to people who are absolutely doing it toughest on or below the poverty line. We're calling on them to use this type of data, use this type of information to really improve and ramp up their planning and funding mechanisms. That might be looking at this rates of economic disadvantage and trying to make sure that they are targeting their responses to where it is most in need. And we're calling on the government to enhance investment for what we're describing as critical social infrastructure. So that's core funding for neighbourhood and community centres, better funding for Aboriginal community controlled organisations, school-based initiatives for kids to lift educational outcomes, targeting those lower socioeconomic areas, and really looking for those specialist target support and advice for people who are really falling through the gaps. So what I'm now going to do is stop sharing this screen and jump over to the first set of tools. So what I'm going to show you is the mapping tool first. Here we go. Can everyone see? Can I get a nod from someone that you can see a screen here with a giant map? Thank you, Susan. I was about to call for you because you're the one I can see. So what I will do is I'll scroll up because I was playing with this before. This is the first online tool. So anyone, this is full access to anyone. What it shows you, and this tool provides the introduction, it explains the methodology, it explains the tools, but it allows you to do primarily two things. First of all, it shows you up here the New South Wales estimate of poverty rates by individual geographies, and it can also show you the changes that have happened in those poverty rates. So those two key metrics, and you can filter that by all of those key demographics that we've just talked through. So if I'll scroll down, so it explains how to use the mapping tool. These are all of the different demographics that you can select so that you can see different maps for each of these. There's a bit of an explanation on how geographies and calculations have been put together. So it's all there for you. And what you can do is then click on, for example, this is that overall rate. And what it can do is if I zoom out, you can see this is the rate of poverty in New South Wales for all of those different SA2s. You could zoom in to any particular area. So why don't I just, for argument's sake, I might jump to the Newcastle area, and you can zoom in and you can see all the different SA2s, all of the different rates for those different, for this one is just the overall rate. And what you can also do is if you're particularly interested in, I think that's Raymond Terrace, it will show you the rate and give you the estimated number of people. If I then go back here, what you can then do is you can do that for men, women, children. You can do this for older people. You can do this for any of those different stakeholder groups. You can then do the exact same thing for the change. So this is what is the rate in 2021. This is the change between 2016 and 2021. So again, it's the exact same tool. It's incredibly simple to use. I can zoom out here and see all of New South Wales. You can see the changes and how that's all appearing. And I can zoom in. This time I might zoom into the Riverina. And it shows you all of the different SA2 areas, and I might click on Narendra Shore, which is, that went up by 3% percentage points. And that's important. It's the percentage points, not the percentage that went up. Or I can come over here and start looking at Cootamundra, 3%, 13%. You can do that yourself. If you're a bit of a nerd like me, you'll have a lot of fun with trying to figure out the different ways in which we can present this in a really engaging and informative way. And just because I can, you can see this is the change for people who are in full-time employment in Greater Sydney. But if I decide to compare that to part-time, you can see the immensely different picture. And that to me is the power of this tool. The other tool that we have available for you is the dashboard. Hope, can I have a wave if you can see a spreadsheet popping up, please? Susan and Hope, thank you. So this is a new tool that we've developed this year. The maps we felt were incredibly useful tool to be able to demonstrate overall pictures, both literally and figuratively, whereas this gives you the ability to get a detailed view of a particular SA2 area. So if we were looking at, I showed you Cootamundra before. So why don't we jump to Cootamundra? So all of this drop-down list, that's all you need to pick. So if I pick the drop-down list and go to Cootamundra, let me walk you through a few different pieces here. So I'll zoom in. So first of all is here. This shows you that estimated rate. It shows you what the 2021 rate is. In this case, it's 15%. It shows you how that's changed since 2016. So in this case, it's gone up by 23%. And it also shows you how is that different to the region average. And that region average is either Greater Sydney or the rest of New South Wales. Cootamundra, rest of New South Wales. And this shows you it's 14% higher than the rest of New South Wales average. And those numbers are over there if you ever needed to refer to them. Then it shows you 4 different views. So by age, household composition, employment status, and ownership. So if I zoom into age, this is showing you a number of things. First of all, for each of the categories within that demographic breakdown, it shows you the poverty rate for Cootamundra, the average for the rest of New South Wales in this case, and then the difference. So what at face value, really quickly, this shows me that Cootamundra, the rate of childhood poverty is 33% higher than the rest of New South Wales average. Whereas for adults, 25 to 64, it's bang on. So if I'm a service delivery agency or if I'm a local council, I can see from an age perspective, some of the groups that maybe are doing it tougher. And then it shows you down here the change. And this immediately shows me that there was a significant increase in poverty rate for young people in Cootamundra. In comparison, it didn't grow as much. It grew by 9%, which is obviously not good, but not nearly as significantly as the rate in Cootamundra. Interestingly as well, kids for Cootamundra, that bucks the trend. This here shows me that the rate in the rest of New South Wales decreased by 32%, but it went up in Cootamundra. So that would be drawing my attention. And similarly here, for older people, it increased by 57, which is much greater than the 15. And that is repeated for all of the other categories. You can see the same thing for household composition. So lone people, couple only, couple with dependent children, single parents. Does the same thing for household ownership. So outright, mortgage, private rental, public rental, it's all the same breakdowns and all the same rules of how it pulls the data out and presents it. And same thing for employment status. We've also color-coded it so that at one glance, you can see, or you should be able to see, where you might draw your attention. So I would be going, okay, big difference here for private rental compared to the rest of New South Wales. And I would also be looking at big increases, like for couple with dependent children, young people, and possibly people who are 65 years and older and not in the labour force. You can also scroll down and see the numbers. sometimes, particularly from an advocacy perspective, I would find that when you start talking about rates, that can be really useful. But where the power can be is when you talk about the numbers. You can say to a local council, there are over 1,100 kids living in Cootamundra who live in poverty. That's much more meaningful to some people than the rate of poverty is 17%. And you can do that, as I said, for any area across the state, and it will change automatically, and you can see it in an easy snapshot. I will stop sharing. I will go back to my presentation. So I've explained what that online mapping tool does. It has those two maps and you can filter. You can only do one at a time. So you can't, for example, if I take men who live in a lone household and see that, it is very much only a lens of men and only a lens of lone households, for example. But I did see that chat popped up. But you can obviously then break it down as you see fit. And on the dashboards, like I said, you can break it down to those demographics, and it shows you the poverty rate for the subgroup, comparison to the average, and the change since 2016. So I'm going to hand over to questions in a moment. What I will do is I'm going to say thank you to all of you, because we're about to turn the recording off in a moment. Thank you to all of you for attending today, and for anyone who's watching this recording. If you do have any questions, please email advocacy@ncos.org.au, and we will do our best to respond to those questions. We really want to make sure that this research is in your hands, it's in the hands of decision makers, so that we can contribute and play our part in trying to eradicate poverty in New South Wales. So I'll turn the recording off, and thank you to all those who are listening. And for the rest of you, we will turn to questions shortly.